Hello, Joy. Shabbat Shalom to you. Is it time, Saul? Hello and Shabbat Shalom. This streaming keeps us on a schedule. Those of you who know me know that I don't like to adhere to a schedule. And it takes away the best part of the service for me, which is being out there and chatting with all of you. But this is the modern age, and so we have to adhere. So we're starting promptly, which for me means starting very early. But it's a joy to be with you and to celebrate Shabbat with you. And it's good to see you all. Here's the plan for tonight. Allison and I have worked out an abridged Shabbat service that will include really just the rudimentary prayers. We don't expect the actual worship to require much of our time. And the reason we've done that is because some of you may have seen the rabbinically speaking column that I wrote for the most recent issue of the Jewish Press. And in it I mentioned podcasts and periodicals that I've been reading since I retired. And I wanted to play a segment, a very important segment from one of those podcasts for you tonight. And that will require 45 minutes, but it is well worth the time. And then after that, if any of you wish to discuss, and by then the streaming is over, thank God. After that, if any of you wish to gather during the Oneg Shabbat, let's reserve maybe the first table closest to the lobby. I'll sit there, and if any of you wish to talk, we'll fill up, or hopefully fill up that table if any of you have things you want to discuss related to the program that I'm going to share with you tonight, or related to anything else that is on your minds. This is a very happy Shabbat for Eileen and me, because this afternoon, early this afternoon, we became grandparents for the first time. So thank you. Jeff, whom many of you know, because he grew up in the temple, and his wife Heather are parents of a baby girl, and we're very excited about that. I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Eileen will tell you all that later. Okay. The name I can tell you, but they did say the baby was tiny, but I assured them that she was born prematurely, but in good health. But I assured them that over the years she'll get bigger, and everything is fine. Beg pardon?
She was in a hurry to meet you, as we all feel about you.
Thank you. You're so kind.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Having said all that, I have to share something else with you. A colleague who's a very good friend of mine sent me a copy this afternoon via email of a sermon that he wrote in 2000, shortly after Joe Lieberman was nominated to be Vice President of the United States. And as I read that sermon this afternoon, I couldn't help but think of how the world has changed. And there's no way that I can say it's changed for the better. It surely has changed for the worse, considerably for the worse. And I just hope and pray that our new grandchild and all of our children and grandchildren and all those who come after us will live in a world that's a better one than we're living in right now. And that's my first prayer tonight. Our next prayer is going to be led by Allison, our wonderful cantorial soloist, Allison. And it's a prayer thanking God for how fortunate we are to be able to come together in community. Hine ma tov.
הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד.
And now we're going to break with Ahavat Shalom tradition. It's a tradition actually that I started here 37 years ago, but we're going to break with it tonight, even though it's an ongoing one, and that is the tradition of inviting any of the women who want to come forward to light the candles to do so. And I'm going to invite two people specifically to do so. Allison's mother-in-law, who happens to be our president, Paula Rosoff, and Paula's sister-in-law, Randy, who was here many times over the years.
Oh, hear my prayer, I sing to you. Be gracious to the ones I love, and bless them with goodness and mercy and peace. Oh, hear my prayer to you. Let us light these lights and see the way to you, and let us say Amen. Let us light these lights and see the way to you, and let us say Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu l'hadlik ner shel Shabbat. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, sovereign of the universe, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to kindle the light of Shabbat.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Shabbat.
Randy is the sister of Paula's husband, Jay, of blessed memory, and the daughter of Abe and Sylvia Rosoff of blessed memory, who, along with Paula and Jay, were pillars, Paula still is, pillars of our congregation for many years and really helped us create community here for all of us. We continue on page 55. May these hours of rest and renewal open our hearts to joy and our minds to truth. May all who struggle find rest on this day. May all who suffer find solace. May all who hurt find healing on this day. May all who despair find purpose. May all who hunger find fulfillment on this day. And may this day fulfill its promise. Baruch atah Adonai Mikadesh HaShabbat. And now we have our prayer for Israel. O Heavenly One, Protector and Redeemer of Israel, bless the state of Israel, which marks the dawning of hope for all who seek peace. And we should add, and the redemption of our people. Shield it beneath the wings of your love. Spread over it the canopy of your peace. Send your light and truth to all who lead and advise, guiding them with your good counsel. Establish peace in the land and fullness of joy for all who dwell there. May you bless the soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces and all who stand guard to protect our people. Shield them from all troubles and injury. Help them secure freedom without loss of life for all those held captive by the enemy. May they have strength and courage of heart. Amen. Amen. And we continue now with the call to worship on page 28. Please rise as Allison leads us. Please remain standing. The Shema is on page 34, and as Allison leads us, she'll precede the Shema by helping us sing Open Up Our Eyes.
Open up our eyes. teach us how to live. Fill our hearts with joy and all the love you have to give. Gather us in peace as you lead us to your name, and we will know that you are one, and we will know that you are one. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kivot Malachuto Leolam Vaed.
If you're able, please continue to stand. If you need to sit down, though, that's okay. We continue on page 39 as we read responsively. In a world torn by violence and pain, a world far from wholeness and peace, give us the courage to say, Adonai, there is one God in heaven and earth. Together, the high heavens declare your glory. May earth reveal your justice and love. From bondage in Egypt we were delivered. At Sinai we bound ourselves to your way. Inspired by prophets and instructed by sages, time and again we overcame oppressive forces. Though our failings are many and our faults are great, it has been our glory to bear witness to our God, keeping alive in dark ages your vision of a world redeemed. Let us continue to work for the day when the nations will be one and at peace. Then shall we rejoice, as Israel did, singing at the shores of the sea. Please be seated. As Allison leads us, chants for us, although she doesn't mind if we sing along. Our prayer asking God to bless us with a restful night's sleep, and then to restore our souls to us, because the tradition is that our souls actually depart our bodies when we sleep. To restore our souls to us and enable us to awaken to new life tomorrow morning. I find that as I think about the world situation, as I think about the fact that our beloved Israel is unfairly portrayed as a pariah in the world and is often, as is currently the case now, forced into untenable situations by the world, as I think about the fact that the haters in both of our political parties in our country are gaining power and increasing in numbers, I have difficulty sleeping, a lot of difficulty sleeping, more than ever before. And so I say this prayer often, and hopefully sometimes it helps. I hope it helps all of you.
Hashkifenu Adonai Eloheinu l'shalom v'hamidenu shumreinu l'chaim Hashkifenu Spread the shelter of your peace over us. Guide us in wisdom, compassion, and trust. Ashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu l'shalom v'hamidenu shumreinu l'chaim. Save us for the sake of your name. Shield us from hatred, from sorrow and pain. Ashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu l'shalom v'hamidenu shumreinu l'chaim.
You know, even though this is a joyous day for me and Eileen and for our kids personally, I've shared some depressing observations tonight, and I do want to temper them by saying that it's so good for us to come together as a group of Jews in community. Not only does it make us feel good, at least I think it does for me, but it also, by sharing with us Judaism's teachings and customs, our coming together helps us maybe do a little more of what we need to do to help change this world and make it good again like it was 25 years ago. It wasn't great then, but it was better than it is now. And I was thinking of a midrash that I learned in rabbinical school. Midrashim are little explanations, sometimes legends, but always an explanation of a custom or a teaching. And the midrash that came to mind today as I was getting ready for services was the one that answers the question, why did our ancestors choose the grape as the fruit to be used in making the wine for the Kiddush? And the Midrash goes on to raise the question, why wasn't it the orange? Oranges grow all over Israel, and you can make orange wine. You can buy it here in Florida. It's made here in Florida, by the way. The answer, according to our ancient teachers, was that grapes grow in a cluster. Oranges grow by themselves. Apples grow by themselves. But grapes grow in a cluster, together with others, to remind us, say the ancient rabbis, of the importance of coming together in community, in family and in larger families, which are communities. I'd like to always think that our community is one that lives up to the commandment at the top of page 43 that I'd like us to read together. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Adonai, help us to walk with good companions, to live with hope in our hearts and eternity in our thoughts, that we may lie down in peace and rise up waiting to do your will. Baruch atah Adonai, haporei sukat shalom aleinu, va'al kol amo Yisrael, va'al Yerushalayim. Amen. Amen. We continue now as we rise again for the tefillah, which is Hebrew for prayer. That's the main part of our worship service. It begins on page 46. We'll continue through page 50. Allison will lead us, but I'm going to interrupt her in the middle to read something in English.
Adonai, sifatai tiftachu fi agir tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu, Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, Ha'el HaGadol, HaGibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, V'konei HaKol, V'zocher Chastei Avot v'Imahot, U'mevi Geula livnei v'neihem, L'ma'an Shemo be'yava. Melech Ozer Moshiach U'Magen, Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Avraham ve'Ezrat Sarah.
Some perished by fire, some by water. Some crossed the sea or watered the desert. Some starved all week to make a Shabbat feast. Some were left childless until old age. Some lifted their chins beneath a father's knife. Those who came before us gave everything so that we, generations later, could glorify you, O God. And despite the dangers, with your protection, some did survive and even flourished. Some reaped in joy, were spared the knife, were granted children. We are their inheritors, O God, and we know how rare is our good fortune to be born to such hard-won treasures. A great responsibility is ours, and yours as well. For if you do not sustain us as you did Abraham and Sarah, Rebekah and Isaac, Jacob, Rachel, and Leah, then who will sing your praises? Who will lift their chins as we do now to sanctify your name? Baruch atah Adonai, Poked Sarah, Umagen Avraham. Amen.
אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי הכל, אתה רב להושיע, משיב הרוח, מוריד הגשם, מחלחל חיים בחסד, מחיי הכל ברחמים רבים, סומך נופים ורופא חולים, ומתיר אסורים, ומחיים אמונתו לשני עפר. מי כמוך בעל גבורות ומי דומה לך, מלך ממית ומחיה ומצמיח ישועה, ונאמן אתה לך חיות הכל. ברוך אתה אדוני מחיי הכל. אתה קדוש ושמך קדוש, וקדושים בכל יום יהלוך סלה. ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש.
And Allison, we're going to change the order just a bit. If you would lead us now in the Misha Beirach for healing, and then we're going to pray silently, and then Shalom Rav. Thank you. And is there anyone here who would like to share a name of someone whom you'd like to especially include in our Misha Beirach prayer for healing tonight? I saw hands here. Rick? Okay. And no one on this side. Janice? Okay. Paula? Randy? Lynn? Okay. Anyone else on this side? Let's go over here. Yeah, please. All the hostages too, yes. Denise? Okay, anyone else here? Allison?
And my father, George Stark.
Yes. And I have a few other names to add as well. Joanne Beeman Fiddleman, Yonatan Reuven Ben Rivka, Charlie Burke, Brad Bliefeld, Tina Burns, Marie D'Alessandro, Denise Hart, Norman Fiddleman, Sue Fischelo, Harry Fleisch, Mitchell Freifeld, David Friedlander, Joyce Holbrook, Jim Howard, Kathy Howard, Susan Caldy, Lou Quall, Irene Lipensky, Ken Mercero, Arnold Miller, William Miller, Michael Ranzino, Stephanie Ross, Carol Spani, Dennis Schulman, Angie Sermons, Jeff Stark, Frank Ziccola.
Beirach Avotenu Mikor HaBracha Limotenu מי שברך אמותינו מקור הברכה לאבותינו. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen.
Please be seated. We pray silently.
Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Ki atahu melech Adon l'chol hashalom. V'tov b'yinecha levarech et amcha Yisrael b'chol leit uv'chol sha'a b'shlomecha. Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam. Shalom Rav Yisrael Amcha Tasim Leolam.
How fortunate we are to have Allison and Joy and Michelle to not just enhance our services, but to really lead our services and help us pray and worship God. And you have so many gifts that you bring, and we're grateful. We're also grateful that our religious school director, Tammy Wolf, is with us. And Tammy just informed me yesterday that she has been accepted into a program in Israel in June that she will attend for 8 days after, well after religious school ends for the season. And it's a program that I understand is for a select group of educators to learn about what the Israelis are going through at this time, and to come back and to teach that to her teachers and to their students here in religious school. And I'm very pleased, and as the Rabbi Emeritus of this congregation, very proud that she's been given that invitation and that honor, and that she is willing to to take the time and to put herself at risk, because all of us who go to Israel at this time do put ourselves at risk, to do that for the kids in our congregation and for the Jewish people. So yes, we can applaud. Before I call upon Paula for some announcements, I want to call upon the longest-standing members who are here today to have the honor of opening the Ark, and to thank them for being the longest-standing members. Now, there are many long-standing members here today. I see plenty of 25-year members. I see some 30-year members. I'm not calling you up. There are a few who are 40-year members, and I want to especially honor them. These are people who are already an integral part of this congregation when I came here 37 years ago, and were active. And I'm looking at Mandy and Tina, and so if the two of you would come up to open the Ark. And I'm looking at Rick and Lisa. In fact, I recall you hosting an event at your home when you were still living in Enniswood, for me to meet meet members of the congregation. And Paula was one of those long-standing, close to 40, if not 40-year members. There are lots of 30-year and 35-year members here, like Janice and Jeff. I apologize for not inviting you this time. The next time I conduct services. But this is just for the real eldest timers, longest standing members. So would you come up to open the Ark, please?
לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני נלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. ונאמר היה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Yeah, you may be seated. Many thanks to Rabbi Klein, Allison, and Joy for leading a wonderful Shabbat service, along with our tech team, Saul Tave and Brad Wexler, and our greeters, Rick Katsev and Elisa Katzif, Lynn Rosenthal, and Sophia Shane. Throughout the month of March, the Social Action Committee invites you to bring clothes, household goods, small appliances, and electronics to the lobby to benefit the Tarpon Springs Shepherd Center, where TAS serves as a primary member. Brotherhood's breakfast meet and greet with bagels and lox will take place on Sunday, April 7th at 9:30 a.m. in the Youth Lounge. Later that day, TAS will host Bay Area Cantorial Association's 20th annual concert, Lev Belev, Heart to Heart, at 3 p.m., of course including our wonderful Joy Katzenguthrie and Allison Rosoff.
And Michelle.
And Michelle, of course. Ron Gilbert will lead our next Shabbat morning minyan on Saturday, April 20th at 9 a.m. Our annual second night Passover Community Seder will take place Tuesday, April 23rd at 6 p.m. RSVP online or by phone. After the service, please join us for an Oneg Shabbat in the social hall, and Shabbat Shalom.
The Kaddish is on page 294. If you'll please rise. Let me read the names first of the people who have died recently. Rabbi Barry Silver, a friend of Lynn Rosenthal. Bobby Chambers, cousin of Lori Bauk, and I knew Bobby. He used to come here with Lori from time to time, a very nice man. Al Leo, who was not Jewish, a practicing Catholic, an active member of a Spiritus Sancti church in Safety Harbor, but was a close personal friend of mine. And he owned Scott Buick, which was the Buick dealership in Pinellas Park. And Al was a very generous donor to this congregation. Every year, from the first year that we started our speaker series, he was one of the major sponsors right up until the year that he went out of business about 14, 15 years ago. And a nice man. And we add to our list of recently deceased Joe Lieberman, whom I consider to be an American hero. And we can talk about why later if you feel like it. But he was, I think, a wonderful, wonderful man, and I wish there were more people like him in government today. Those people for whom we observe Yahrzeit tonight are Sidney Bassick, Jacob Becker, Leonard Bolnick, Morris Broder, Jay Byron, Sally Kaplan, Emmanuel Cohn, Charles Cohn, Dale Ferguson, Irving Friedman, Israel Nathan Goldsmith, Beatrice Goldsmith, Hazel Golub, B. Grant, Marshall Greenman, Adele Katz, Joseph Katz, Miriam Cronenberg, Harold Lipton, Reuben Miller, Leonard Rothschild, Thelma Rubin, Beverly Slavny, Abraham Michael Sokoloff, Len Sternbane, Delcy Suppo, Harvey Sussman, Jerry Tobin, Louis Unger, Diane Vigder, David Wachtel, and Margot Werner. Are there any other people whose yahrzeits occur this week? Yes, please. Thank you. It's good to see you. Thank you. Anyone else? Then let's join together, page 294. 294. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, v'yomod divrah hirutei, v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon uv'yomechon, uv'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uv'izman koriv v'imru amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mavorach le'olam u'le'omei omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. v'yit hadar, v'yit aleh, v'yit halal, shemei dekudashah barihu, le'elah min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbachata v'nechemata, da'amiran ba'alma v'imaru amen. Yehei shalama rabba min shomaya v'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imaru amen. Osei shalom bimromav hu ya'asei shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imaru amen. And we now, I think we're just going to have the short Kiddush today because we have this big presentation. So, since it's only one line, I'll read.
Sounds good.
And the Motzi you'll get to hear only if you stay through the presentation. Because we'll do that after the presentation when we gather in the social hall for Oneg. Everybody, join me.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Borei peri hagafen. Amen.
Allison, do you want to sit?
Sure.
And do you have a final song?
Not on the list, but we can certainly make one. We
Go
can.
ahead, bring one. This is such a treat to hear you.
Okay.
Remain standing
How
if
about
you
you,
can.
Shira? Oh, you know what? Lola.
Very appropriate for the subject of our talk tonight.
And
This
one
is-
of your favorites.
It's from the Talmud. It says it's not up to you to complete the task of making the world a better place, but neither are you free to desist from beginning it. JFK used it in his inauguration speech.
Lo alecha hamlecha ligmor, lo alecha ligmor, lo alecha hamlecha ligmor, lo alecha ligmor, velo ata ben chorin lehivatel mimnena, velo ata ben chorin, velo ata ben chorin lehivatel mimnena, velo ata ben chorin. Lo alecha hamlecha ligmor, lo alecha ligmor, lo alecha hamlecha ligmor, lo alecha ligmor, velo ata ben chorin lehivatel mimnena, velo ata ben chorin, velo ata ben chorin lehivatel mimnena, velo ata ben chorin.
Please be seated. Our presentation tonight, this is from a podcast that Dan Senor writes or produces. Dan Senor wrote the book Startup Nation, which I know some of you have probably read. And he interviews today Matti Friedman, who is a well-known independent Israeli reporter and news analyst. And he's talking about what Hamas knew that the rest of the world didn't know. And as I said, those who'd like to discuss it afterwards while we're at Oneg Shabbat, I'm happy to sit at this first table with any who wish to talk about it. But in the meantime, just listen and learn.
A lot of people in the West watching this incredible event on October 7th, this massacre of hundreds of civilians, 1,200 people killed on that day, plus about 250 people taken hostage. And people were watching this saying, what are they thinking? And this was clearly some kind of miscalculation. No one, of course, could support the kind of atrocities we'd seen on October 7th. I think that 4 months in, it seems pretty clear that they understood things about the West that many Westerners didn't understand. I think that the idea that they miscalculated was a bit facile. I think that they understand something deep about the world that we have learned in the past 4 months, but which they clearly knew on October 7th.
Every day, we see news accounts in mainstream print publications flashing across our phones, on social media, and on television. Reported, and I put the word reported in quotes, reported by reputable journalists. There's typically one frame for all of these stories. That is, in one sentence, the post-October 7th war is a story about Gazan Palestinians as the victims of Israel. I mean, to give one recent example, during the early morning of February 12th, Israel rescued two Israeli hostages, 60-year-old Fernando Simon Marman and 70-year-old Luis Har. Marman and Har had been kidnapped from kibbutz Nir Yitzchak on October 7th. The IDF, the Shin Bet, and special police forces rescued these two innocent men from a building in Rafah in southern Gaza. Rafah, the place that the international community has been lecturing Israel that they cannot wage military action. Well, according to public reports, one Israeli soldier was injured in this daring operation, and 37 Hamas terrorists, including the hostages' guards, were killed. But what received the most press attention internationally in the days after this rescue operation was a report, according to Amnesty International, that the operation and airstrikes by Israel to rescue these two elderly men led to the deaths of at least, according to the reports, 95 Palestinian civilians. That was the story that broke through over here in the diaspora, in the West. So two innocent elderly men are being held hostage by Hamas in a civilian neighborhood in Gaza, a civilian neighborhood where Israel had to fight with a Hamas battalion that was based there in order to get to the hostages. And the story becomes Israel kills Palestinian civilians. Now, we all have examples of stories like this dating back to the first days of this war following the October 7th massacre by Hamas. And we can be outraged at this coverage, or we can ask, how does it happen? How do journalists operate in Gaza and around the world that produce a frame like the one I just described? And is this a case study into what Hamas had figured out long before October 7th? The mechanics of how they, the forces of barbarism rather than the forces of civilization, could manage the international press reaction to their massacre of October 7th. Well, there's one person above all that I've been wanting to discuss this with. His name is Mati Friedman, and he's one of the most thoughtful writers and analysts when it comes to all matters related to Israel and the broader Middle East, and also in the trends in the world of journalism. He's a monthly writer for Tablet magazine and a regular contributor to The Atlantic. His newest book is called Who by Fire? Leonard Cohen in the Sinai. And I had him on the podcast a couple of years ago on a trip to Jerusalem to discuss that book. Before that, he wrote another book called Spies of No Country, Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel. And before that, Pumpkin Flowers, a soldier's story of a forgotten war. That book is about his service in Lebanon. Mati's army service has included multiple tours in Lebanon. His work as a reporter has taken him from Israel to Lebanon, Morocco, Moscow, the Caucasus, and Washington, D.C. He's a former Associated Press correspondent and an essayist for the New York Times opinion section. But it was his time covering Hamas's takeover of Gaza that led Mati to study with great detail the mechanics of how Hamas manipulates the media, NGOs, the international community, and any stakeholder that does business or government work of some sort in Gaza. And according to Mati, they are working from that same playbook right now, perhaps quite masterfully. Mati Friedman on how Hamas fooled the world. This is Call Me Back. And I am pleased to welcome back to this podcast my longtime friend, Mati Friedman, who joins us from Jerusalem. In fact, the last time I was with Mati was in Jerusalem when we recorded an episode about his terrific book, which was in many respects a simpler time, and now we are in anything but a simple time. Mati, thanks for being with us.
Hi, Dan.
So, Mati, this piece you wrote for the Free Press called The Wisdom of Hamas, I read and I got a hold of you. It really shook me for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is I feel like this piece was actually here in 2023 when you published this piece, was a sequel to your 2014 tablet piece about your experience covering Hamas in Gaza and understanding the model for how the Western press covers Hamas, which I want to get to momentarily. But before we do, I just want to quote from your piece here. You wrote, "In many ways, Hamas understood the world better than we Israelis did. The men who came across the border and those who sent them may have grasped the current state of the West better than many Westerners. More than anything, they understood the war they're fighting when many of us didn't and still don't." So what do you mean by that? What did Hamas get that the Israelis didn't?
And not just the Israelis. I think a lot of people in the West watching this incredible event on October 7th, this massacre of hundreds of civilians, about 1,200 people ultimately killed on that day, plus about 250 people taken hostage. And people were watching this saying, what are they thinking? And this was clearly some kind of miscalculation, because what this is going to do is draw an incredible Israeli response. The world at the time seemed to be pretty staunchly on Israel's side. No one, of course, could support the kind of atrocities we'd seen on October 7th. And this was being discussed as a miscalculation by Hamas. If you look at the coverage in the first few days after the attack, the word miscalculation recurs.
Meaning in the press coverage, it was all about Hamas's miscalculation. The smart set over here on my side of the world was, they've overshot. They don't understand what they've gotten themselves into. And what you're saying is they knew exactly what they were getting themselves into.
I think that 4 months in, it seems pretty clear that they understood things about the West that many Westerners didn't understand. And that became clear very quickly. I think that the appearance of anti-Israel demonstrations immediately after the Hamas attack, on the same day, in fact, on October 7th, there were already demonstrations against Israel. It's very strange that an attack against Jews, in fact, the most costly attack on Jews since the Holocaust, ends up eliciting very fierce demonstrations against Jews. Now, that's very mysterious. You'd think that the demonstrations would be against the perpetrators of the attack, and that didn't happen. And I think that Hamas understood that the media response to this was a very short period of initial sympathy, followed by an intense moral critique of Israel's response. The international community, the organs of the United Nations, the NGO world, human rights organizations, which you would expect to understand the kind of violation of human rights that occurred on October 7th, they, within a week or two are back into their customary critique of Israel. And Hamas understood that all of this would happen. Hamas understood that after an initial period of sympathy, the criticism would be directed at Israel. And the organs of the international community, whether it's the UN, whether it's the NGOs, or whether it's the press, would be focused on restraining Israel's response, which would mean that Hamas would ultimately be able to weather the Israeli response, remain on its feet at the end of the war, and declare victory. Why do they think that? Because that has happened repeatedly in the past in the smaller wars that have led up to this one. So I think that the idea that they miscalculated was a bit facile. I think that they understand something deep about the world that we have learned in the past 4 months, but which they clearly knew on October 7th.
I just want to take issue with that because I, full disclosure, was one of those people who on October 7th, in the immediate days after October 7th, thought, okay, now the world is finally going to see what Israel is dealing with in Hamas, because unlike the previous conflicts, unlike May of 2021, unlike 2018, unlike 2014, unlike we can go back through all these skirmishes between Hamas and Israel. Many of them were awful, but they were skirmishes. They didn't have the civilizational struggle element to them that this one seemed to have. They didn't have the barbarism that this one had. They didn't have the mutilation and the dismembering and the live burning of Israeli innocents, the raping, the sexual assault as a military campaign tool. They didn't have the unbelievable brutality towards children, and then obviously the kidnapping of massive numbers of just the most vulnerable people. The taking hostage of Israeli soldiers is awful, but then taking hostage of a Holocaust survivor in her mid-80s and of little kids, of a 9-month-old baby, and all broadcast. They wanted the world, it seems, to see all this. They had their GoPro cameras, and they wanted everything telegraphed. So I actually felt, Mati, this was different. And that sadly, tragically, thanks to the depths that Hamas was willing to go in this war, unlike it seemed that they were not willing to go in previous wars, and the fact that they wanted it all, available at a theater near you, so to speak, that everyone could view it, it did feel different. By the way, when I say full disclosure, right, because I feel like an idiot, because I said, okay, now everyone's going to see what Israel's dealing with. And then I watched the outrage in the West. In my own city, in New York City, I saw the outrage being directed not at the people who did these things, not at Hamas, but the outrage was being directed at Jews for objecting to being slaughtered. So I am victim to exactly what you're describing, but I still feel like this was different. So one could understand why we thought they may have overshot.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that was quite a logical conclusion. And if I didn't know the world of the international press from the inside, I spent about 6 years as a reporter and editor for the AP here in Jerusalem, and I've got an insider's view of the world, not just of the Western press, but of the whole international world that really generates the news story from here. And again, it's the world of the press, of big NGOs like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, the United Nations, the diplomatic corps, the European diplomatic corps to some extent. If I didn't know that world quite well, and if I hadn't had the experience of trying to cover these events for a big Western news organization, I would have concluded what you concluded, which is that now it's going to be very clear not only what Israel faces now, but what Israel has always been facing. Because if you understand what happened on October 7th, I think you get a pretty clear picture, for example, of why there is a military occupation in the West Bank. The reason that there's a military occupation in the West Bank is because Israelis are afraid that if we cede territory to the Palestinians, this is what's going to happen. And the fear is based on our experience in the years 2000 to 2004, the years of the Second Intifada, where the most left-wing government Israel had ever elected ended up being on the receiving end of the worst wave of terrorism that we'd ever experienced. So, my 30 years or so in Israel and my time in the press showed me that expectation that now people will see is an expectation that will never be realized. One of the moments for me was 9/11, which you certainly remember. It's the middle of the Second Intifada. So Israel's in this wave of suicide bombings and attacks that ultimately killed more than 1,000 Israelis. And in the middle of all this, America is hit with a spectacular suicide attack coming out of the same ideology, coming out of the same part of the world. And many of us said, okay, now everyone is going to get it. And that's not what happened. And in fact, fast forward 20 years and we can see that the forces that generated 9/11 and that generated the suicide bombings of the early aughts and that generated October 7th, in some bizarre way, those circles are more popular in parts of the West than Israel is. So obviously there's some deep and complicated and disturbing mechanism at play here. That's one that I think Hamas is more closely attuned to than many rational observers are.
You mentioned your time as a reporter, and I want to talk about that. You wrote a piece for Tablet in 2014, which was a long piece. I will say, I'm not just saying this because you're my guest today, I say this all the time. If I had to pick a half a dozen pieces, long-form pieces, for those who have been awoken, I hate to use that word, awoken by October 7th in terms of they're shaken to their core and they're thinking, wow, how did I miss this story or miss important aspects of this story? And these are many people who are very sympathetic to Israel who feel this way. They want to read and they want to understand. Your essay for Tablet 2014, which we'll link to in the show notes, is one of the pieces I recommend. It had a huge impact on me because it was the first piece that I think was written in, there were people who beat up on the press all the time and some of them, I don't always think are operating in good faith. You know, they have like an ideological axe to grind, whereas I felt like your piece was written in perfectly good faith. You were a reporter. You were happy to have a career as a reporter, meaning as at a mainstream Western news organization. You were a reporter for the Associated Press, and you were then covering Hamas in Gaza, Hamas's takeover in Gaza, and you were watching how your colleagues were covering Hamas. You were watching how you were sort of being supervised to cover Hamas bureaucratically, like how your news organization was sort of organized to handle news coming out of Gaza. And you slowly realized that Hamas had completely manipulated the Western press coverage, which you've alluded to earlier in this conversation. And then I want to get into how that's a model for other organizations working in Gaza. But can you first just summarize that 2014 piece, because it's extremely important and it really sets up, I think, a lot of your thinking about what's happening now.
Sure, I mean, this should only take 6 or 7 hours, so I assume that all of your listeners will just bear with me. Was at the AP between 2006 and the very end of 2011. Went in pretty naive about the Western press. I had a very kind of Woodward and Bernstein impression of what news reporting was, and found myself with something very different. I'm an Israeli of left-leaning political sympathies and didn't expect to have any trouble at a big international news organization, and I did. And to make a very complicated story much simpler, what I found was that news decisions were being dictated not by journalistic considerations, but by a form of ideological activism that seemed to have taken hold in part of the press. At the time, I interpreted this as a problem that was limited to Israel. And if you read that essay that I wrote for Tablet in 2014, which was followed up by part 2, which appeared in The Atlantic a few weeks later, so it's really 2 essays that are part of the same argument. If you read those essays, you'll see that I'm very focused on Israel. I didn't yet understand that this was a much broader phenomenon, and it took a few years to really grasp that the move of the press corps to a kind of ideological activism was something that was happening across the board, and we really saw it in the 2016 election, and we've seen it since then. I mean, now it's really hard to find any journalism that isn't a form of ideological activism on the left or the right. And at the time, I didn't quite get that, and I was just focused on the events that I had seen in my bureau, which were events which were representative of something broader that had happened in the press here. And I felt that I was being asked to write a story that wasn't true, that the considerations that my superiors were using to decide what should be covered and how were decisions that were unrelated to the facts of the story I was supposed to be covering, that they were connected to some very strange ideological fantasy that was being dictated mainly by editors from the United States. And I just couldn't hack it. After a while, I left at the end of 2011 and struck out on my own and tried to detail those experiences in writing a few times, not just to blow off steam, but to explain to consumers of news that what they're getting is not what they think. What you're getting when you read a lot of news coverage, not all, but a lot of news coverage is not a description of reality. It's rather a kind of political campaign that's designed to sway you to the right political conclusion. And that's not only true of Israel. We can think of many other examples. But Israel is certainly one example, and it's a prominent example because of how heavily the story is covered. I've written this numerous times, but when I was at the AP, we had 40 full-time news staffers covering this story, which is Israel and the Palestinians. It's about 14 million, 15 million people on a piece of land that is 1/100th of 1% of the surface of the world, and 1/5 of 1% of the landmass of the Arab world. I'm in a very small place. And we had more people here than we had in China at the time. It's a country of 1.3 billion people. We had more people here than we had in all of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa combined.
Meaning you had more journalists for the AP covering this story than you had covering China.
At that time, that's right. This is between 2006 and the very end of 2011. We had more people here than we had in all 50-something countries of sub-Saharan Africa combined. And this was the AP's biggest international bureau at the time, and the AP is the world's biggest news organization, according to the AP. So we're talking about a story that gets massive amounts of coverage, which makes it a very prominent example of what's gone wrong in the press. But the problem is not limited to Israel. And what we're seeing now with the coverage of the October 7th and post-October 7th story, if we can call it coverage, because a lot of it isn't really coverage, but it's a broader ecosystem. It's coming not just out of one bureau. It's not coming just from the press. It's coming from the academy. It's coming from the NGO world. It's coming from the United Nations. It's coming from the kind of ideological ecosystem that drives a lot of what passes as news coverage and what I think makes so many events in the world impossible to understand for news consumers in the West. You can read the story that the New York Times writes about this place and try to use it as a map to understand what's going on here. Like if you come to Israel, get off the plane with the New York Times story as a map to events here, events won't make any sense because the story has very little to do with the actual events. It won't help you understand what's going on. And most journalism, I think, on the left and to a large extent on the right, is no longer designed to help you understand what's going on. It's part of an ideological messaging system that's unrelated to events in foreign countries. And I couldn't be part of it, so that's why I left. And I've tried to shine a light on it since then with, obviously without any great success in affecting the course of the deterioration of the press over the last decade, but I have tried.
So I take the disproportionate number of people covering the story, but again, if these people saw what you and I saw in October of 2023, on October 7th, just the images and the depravity of the approach to warfare, a lot of people covering it shouldn't detract from what's happening right in front of their eyes. So how does that change?
It depends what you think the job of journalists should be. I mean, if you think that the job of a journalist is to explain what's going on, then yes, it's a problem. If you think that the job of a journalist is actually to fight for justice using coverage, that news coverage is actually a weapon in a fight to make the world better, then you make different choices of what stories to cover and how to present it. So, if you look at October 7th, through our eyes, we see an act of medieval barbarism that is, carried out by a group of religious fanatics who have their own ideology, which they're quite open and honest about. I guess you could say, to their credit, but which is very far from any liberal Western values that we're familiar with. And it seems like a pretty clear-cut example of a very regressive and violent force attacking a democratic country, murdering civilians, raping women, kidnapping children. And it seems fairly clear-cut. It seems obvious that the military of that country is going to have to do what it can to eliminate the threat. And it doesn't seem necessarily that complicated. But if you think that news coverage is actually a kind of parable about oppression, and that in this story, Palestinians are oppressed and the Israelis are oppressors, then your news coverage has to be calibrated to help your reader reach the right conclusion. And in order for that to happen, you have to play down Israel's concerns to the extent possible. You have to play up Israel's faults to the extent possible, and you have to play down Palestinian faults and present them as something approaching perfect victims. And that has been the case in news coverage here for the past 20 years at least. It certainly was the case when I was involved in it, and I blame myself as much as anyone else. I was party to it, and it's the case now. So if you know how the system here works, you knew that within a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks after October 7th, the whole system would swing back to its comfort zone, which is a story about Israel oppressing, harming, killing Palestinian civilians for no reason other than cruelty and Israel's own innate evil. And it seemed impossible to believe that on October 7th or October 8th. But here we are. So it clearly happened, and I think that's something that Hamas understood quite well, having been through this a few times in the past. And I think that they understood the response. They knew that within 3 weeks, a month, some Western leaders would already be very bluntly criticizing Israel for civilian deaths. And that happened. Macron, after 5 weeks, within a day or two, Trudeau in Canada saying the same thing, that Israel is needlessly killing civilians. But the circle has widened, and of course the American administration seems to be wavering after 4 months. So Hamas understood that if you can just hang on while the international community swings against the Israelis and ties Israel's hands, then there's a good chance that they're still going to be standing at the end of all of this, and I'm not sure that they're wrong.
Last question on this particular point. You also explain in your piece how reporters in Gaza, which you observed firsthand, how they're sort of captured by Hamas, not just because of their ideological predisposition, meaning the reporters or the news organizations they represent, but also because Hamas sets up a system in Gaza that, as a reporter, you can't really do your job unless you're willing to play ball with them. And I think this is important for two reasons. A, I think it helps explain what you're describing here. And B, we now realize it's also a model for how other organizations that aren't the media, like UNRWA is very much in the news right now. It's a very similar dynamic. I think about your piece. UNRWA can't really function in Gaza without working with Hamas. So can you explain how it worked with the media and then extrapolate out to other entities, NGOs, human rights groups, UNRWA, other UN agencies?
I was an editor on the AP desk in Jerusalem at the very end of 2008 during the first really bad round of violence between Hamas and Israel. Hamas came to power in Gaza in 2007. I guess you'd call it a war, although compared to the one we're having now, it seems pretty small. But there was a war that began at the very end of 2008, and at the time we had a very good Palestinian reporter, a native of Gaza, and he'd been excellent up to that point. And he reported that Hamas fighters were wearing civilian clothes and being counted as civilians in the death toll. And that was a very important piece of information because the death toll had become the center of coverage. So, the reporters will describe different events in the war on a given day. The punchline or the thrust of the article will be how many people are being killed, particularly on the Palestinian side where the death toll is always higher. So the fact that many of the people who are supposedly civilians are actually armed fighters, that's an important piece of information. And I put it in the story, and then a few hours later he called and asked me to take it out. And it seemed very clear that someone had spoken to him. Of course I took it out. I wasn't going to get a reporter hurt over a piece of information in a story, but I suggested at the time that we append an editor's note to the story that made clear to readers that we were now cooperating with Hamas censorship. And I was overruled. So the piece of information came out. We never informed our readers that we were now playing ball with Hamas press restrictions. And since that point, more or less, the AP, like the rest of the Western press, plays ball with Hamas. You'll almost never see video or photos of a rocket launch from a civilian area. There's a reason for that. I spoke to TV cameramen who covered the 2014 war, and they told me that they would stand at the entrance to Shifa Hospital, which is where the casualties come in. It's the biggest hospital in Gaza, and they were allowed to film civilian casualties coming in, but when Hamas casualties came in, there was a Hamas minder at the door to the hospital, and he would signal to them to turn off their cameras, and they would. So Hamas became very adept at presenting an image of a war that wasn't really a war. It was just Israeli violence directed at Palestinian civilians. Hamas just made itself disappear, so you just don't see Hamas. And they've done it again, I think, with some success. I mean, the Gaza Health Ministry, which is Hamas, will release casualty figures that don't differentiate between civilians and fighters, and that's to give you the impression that the civilian death toll is extremely high. And Western reporters play along with it. So part of it is censorship. Most of the work of the Western press in Gaza, and at the moment all of it, is done by Palestinians who are from Gaza and who live under Hamas control. That means that these people cannot cross Hamas. I'm not saying anything about their integrity. I'm just saying that if you live under Hamas rule, you do what Hamas says because the consequences for you can be very severe. The Western press, thus, is limited, and we were told at the AP that we couldn't report certain things because it would put our staff in Gaza at risk. So you have staff in Gaza, in theory, to help you better cover the story, but in fact, the fact that you have staff living under Hamas control allows Hamas to put a gun to your head and decide what you can and cannot cover because you can't get your staff in trouble. But the truth of the matter is that the details that Hamas is trying to censor are generally things that the Western press doesn't want to cover anyway, because the story as it's been set up is a story about Israeli oppressors and Palestinian victims. So the details, like the Hamas military buildup, this incredible subterranean city that they've built over the past 10, 15 years, the incredible amount of weapons they've managed to smuggle in, all this stuff is irrelevant to a story about Israeli oppressors. So it's ignored. You haven't heard much about this incredible infrastructure project under Gaza, which is quite an accomplishment for Hamas. All the big Western organizations have permanent presences in Gaza. You haven't heard much about it.
It's mind-blowing. It blows my mind. I think about that. I think, wait a minute, you guys this organization managed to build 350 miles approximately of tunnels deep underground in a tiny space, tiny geographic space. I just think about the logistics involved. I think about the amount of cement and cement trucks and all sorts of equipment.
I mean, the disposal of the earth that's being removed, talking about thousands of workers. And we're talking about a very impressive strategic plan. I mean, these weren't just people digging under their garage. Someone had a plan for the way this was going to work. Someone who is clearly some kind of ruthless genius of some kind, and they webbed the entire Gaza Strip with this subterranean city that necessarily means that in any war with Gaza, there will be a civilian catastrophe because Hamas is operating literally under civilians. And you would have expected that to be covered because it's clearly one of the key developments in the context of this story over the past decade, and yet it's barely covered. And again, part of that is censorship, and part of that is just the ideological inclinations of the press, which are looking for stories of Palestinian victimhood, and they're not really interested in looking at Hamas, what it's up to in Gaza, what the ramifications of that will be, or what its ideology is. If you look back over press coverage over the past decade and a half, you're not going to see a lot about that.
So now put this in the context of what we're learning about UNRWA, which, literally, UNRWA employees not only involved with Hamas and sympathetic to Hamas, but actually participating in the October 7th massacre and taking Israelis hostage. And the reports are available for everyone to see now. The most recent story that just rocked me a couple weeks ago about how the UNRWA headquarters was literally the data center for Hamas. So Hamas's IT center is directly underground the UNRWA headquarters, so much so that the electrical cords from the Hamas data center go right up into the UNRWA facility. So when you say that Western reporters just want to look the other way because it's not the story, you could say the same thing about UNRWA, but it's even worse. It's like a worse version of what you described in 2014.
I think Hamas is very canny at using the organs of the international community as force multipliers. And the media is one example. The media, by collaborating with Hamas over the past 15 years or so, turned itself into an amplifier for one of the most regressive and dangerous ideologies in play on planet Earth. And that has certainly happened. You have organizations like UNRWA, which is the UN organization specifically dedicated to Palestinian refugees. And when people think of a UN agency in Gaza, I think they're imagining a bunch of Swedish people distributing bags of rice or something. But UNRWA is a Palestinian organization that's funded by the international community. That's functionally what it is. And part of being a Palestinian organization in Gaza is collaborating with Hamas. So not only did UNRWA personnel take part in the October 7 massacre because they were members of Hamas, there are many examples of Hamas using UNRWA facilities to protect their military assets. And the most blatant example was the one you're describing, where the Hamas data center is literally underneath. I mean, it was obviously constructed at great expense. It obviously made a great deal of noise. You don't build a massive structure underneath a building without people in the building noticing. They ran the cables, as you mentioned, from upstairs to downstairs, and it was all very blatant. And not only did the UN turn a blind eye or actively cooperate with it, but of course the press, which you'd expect to be covering the UN, also somehow missed it. Very interesting. So you have this story in Gaza, which is basically not being reported. The only safe story for reporters to cover is a story of Palestinian victimhood. Hamas will let you cover that. Politically, it's the right story to cover because it'll fit in with the prevalent ideologies on the left, which is the world that generates most of the reporters. So that's a safe story to cover. You're going to get a lot about Palestinian suffering and Palestinian anguish. By the way, much of it true. What's going on in Gaza right now is a tragedy. It's a catastrophe, and many of the dead are civilians, and it's awful and horrific. And it's the result of a decision that Hamas made on October 7th and the result of a battlefield that Hamas constructed in Gaza. So I'm not trying to suggest that there isn't a tragedy in Gaza. I'm just, trying to allocate responsibility in the right direction and point out that the organizations of the international community, including the press and including the United Nations, have not only ignored it, but have actively abetted Hamas in creating the world that leads up to October 7th.
One observation you make in the Free Press piece, the article titled The Wisdom of Hamas, is you describe there's a misunderstanding of what Hamas actually is. And I guess my question for you is, we're coming to believe that Hamas is a religious jihadist movement, but the way the press reports on it and the way the West seems to understand it is that of a national movement. Because each definition offers a completely different idea of what motivated Hamas on October 7th. Is it a jihadist movement or is it a national movement?
One thing that I encountered during my time in the press was an unwillingness to simply listen to what Hamas was saying. One of the admirable things about Hamas is that they say what they mean, and all you have to do is listen. So, for example, when Hamas won the Palestinian election in 2006, it was a good time to profile Hamas and explain what this group was, which seemed to be the most popular faction among Palestinians. And Hamas has helpfully provided us with its founding charter, which explains exactly what it is. And the charter is a fascinating document that's drawn in parts from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it explains that Hamas is at war with Jews, not with the State of Israel, that Jews are responsible not just for both world wars, but for the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, and that they operate using the media, they operate using B'nai B'rith, and they operate using the Rotary Club.
This is such an amazing quote you wrote here in the piece. When I was a reporter for an international news agency at the time of the Hamas takeover in Gaza in 2007, I discovered that it was impolitic to mention what Hamas clearly announced in its founding charter from 1998, namely that, quote, our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious, and the Jews were behind the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and most of the revolutions we heard and hear about here and there. With their money, they formed secret societies such as Freemasons, Rotary clubs, the Lions, and others in different parts of the world for the purpose of sabotaging societies and achieving Zionist interests. So I actually had never seen that language. That was like an earlier iteration of the Hamas Charter, I guess. But they're fixated on basically Jewish country clubs in suburban areas of the Midwest in the United States.
And rightly so. The ideology presented in the Charter and presented by Hamas leaders when they're speaking is very clearly a religious ideology that sees Jews as a kind of cosmic evil and that believes itself to be channeling the word of God. They think that the sovereignty of non-Muslims in this part of the world is forbidden and that anything is permissible to reverse it. Jews need to be murdered until Jewish sovereignty is dissolved. And the Charter says all of this, and Hamas leaders said and say all of this quite openly. This isn't about creating a Palestinian state, certainly not one alongside Israel. It's about Islam, and this is an Islamic movement that believes itself to be listening to God and serving his will. And I think that's easier for religious people to understand than for very secular people. So sometimes when I explain this kind of stuff to people who grew up with scripture at home, people who are believing Christians, people who come from religious Jewish homes, it's not that hard for them to understand because you grew up with the idea that God is speaking to us through holy texts, and we try to understand God's will and we try to perform his will, whatever it takes. And that's what Hamas is saying. They're not saying we want some kind of rational solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that allows people to move on with their lives. This is a deeply religious movement, and it's Western interpreters who often disguise that or refuse to listen to it and explain to us, yes, this is just very belligerent rhetoric that's designed to energize the Hamas base. What they really want is timely garbage collection and a government that isn't corrupted. By the way, after the 2006 election of Hamas, I literally heard those sentences from some people in the press. They were saying Hamas is basically about good governance. And meanwhile, Hamas was saying God is commanding us to kill the Jews even if they're hiding behind trees and stones, which is almost verbatim a sentence that appears in the Hamas Charter. So there's an unwillingness to listen to what they say, and then October 7th happens and people are kind of flabbergasted, but that's actually what Hamas has been saying all along. Hamas leader in 2019 is on tape calling on supporters across the world to find a Jew, buy a knife, and do what needs to be done. And this is all very open. It's the press that has not covered it because it's interested in a story where the Jews are the oppressors, and this is just a complicating factor. So, I think that clearly there have been very broad failures in coverage and in understanding, which are leading to this intense confusion, or which maybe are contributing. There are other factors which are contributing to this intense moment of confusion in the West, but I think that one of the key things that Hamas understands, you can kind of dismiss the Charter and dismiss the Rotary Club business as insanity, but I think that's something that Hamas understands is that they see themselves as part of a war against Jews that is global in its scope and historic in its chronology. And they understand themselves as having hundreds of millions of allies, maybe billions of allies around the world. And I think they're right, because if you look at events over the past 4 months, then you'll see that a disturbingly large number of people on Earth believe that Jews are a problem that they must confront. And this includes people like Hamas and the radical Islamic world and its sympathizers, but it also includes French labor unions and British labor unions and Russian nationalists and their sworn enemies among Ukrainian nationalists, and it includes ideologues and influencers from the Chinese Communist Party. It includes most of the population of Indonesia, where there are no Jews. And it seems to be a sentiment that is prevalent across large swaths of the globe. And I think that Jewish people like me have not really wanted to look that in the face. And if you grew up in a nice city in the late 90s, like I did, I grew up in Toronto, and you could dismiss all of this as the fevered memories of your grandparents. And, on occasion you'd see a swastika spray painted on a gravestone somewhere, or, some boycott of Israel, or someone would say something off color, and you would just dismiss it as being unrelated data points, maybe holdovers from a different time. What's clear now is that these are indicators of a very powerful and popular ideology that brings together vast numbers of people from very different backgrounds and very different parts of the world. And Hamas knows that because they operate in that world. So they understand that if they attack Jews on October 7th, a lot of people are going to applaud it. And we're kind of flabbergasted by it. We couldn't understand why on October 7th, the Hamas attack triggers protests against Jews. That surprised us, but it didn't surprise Hamas.
Last question for you, Mati. You recently wrote a piece, also for the Free Press, just a couple weeks ago called "What If the Real War in Israel Hasn't Even Started?" That's the title of the piece. Take the current war with Hamas and multiply it by 10. That's what war with Hezbollah would look like. And Israelis are not asking if it will begin, but when. I don't want to get into the whole possibility of a war with Hezbollah. Maybe we'll have you back on to have a separate conversation about it. But what you're just describing about Hamas, do you think the same thing applies to Hezbollah? That it is also a global religious movement rather than an organization that was created just for the purpose of the social welfare of the people it serves and for some kind of national self-determination, although I don't even know what their national self-determination would be, because they're Shiite Muslims that exist in Lebanon and other parts of the Levant in the Middle East. They don't pretend to have claims on what is today Israel. So is Hezbollah just another version of what you're describing with regard to Hamas?
Well, first of all, I hope we never have a chance to have that conversation, and I hope it's never necessary. And I also apologize for writing very dark articles recently. I wish we could meet to discuss something more cheerful. But Hezbollah, like Hamas, is very open about what it is. Hezbollah means the party of God. That's what it means in Arabic. And Hezbollah is an arm of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and part of the Islamic Revolution that's represented by the Islamic Republic in Iran. And they don't claim to be out for a rational solution to the problems of the Middle East. They certainly don't claim to be out for democracy and liberalism. They believe that they are serving the will of God, and that the will of God is for this part of the world, if not the entire world, to come under the rule of Islam. And Israel is really a symbol of what they hate, because it's a non-Muslim power in a part of the world that they interpret as being theirs. It's a liberal country. It's a country where women have rights, where gay people have equality, and all of this is anathema to them. So they're very open about it. If you listen to what they say in Arabic and often in English, they're very clear about what they're up to and what they want. And I don't blame them. I don't think they're hiding who they are. I blame Western observers for creating a fictional story about what's going on here. The idea that there's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict and that's the story here is fiction. A fiction that's designed to create an easily comprehensible news story. Most of Israel's wars have not been fought against Palestinians. Israel's fought wars against Syrians and Egyptians and Jordanians and others, and Israel's most potent enemy at the moment is Iran, of course, and those forces are not Palestinian. So clearly there's a regional conflict going on here that isn't an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that's the way Israelis see it. I mean, if you're a Jew whose grandparents had to run away from Yemen, for example, came to Israel, and now you're on the northern border fighting Hezbollah, which are Shia Muslims from Lebanon, are you engaged in an Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Your story is about the Middle East. Your story is about a Jewish minority in the Middle East being forced from its ancestral homes and driven back to the national homeland, where we kind of set up shop in the late 40s and 50s and try to hack out a space for us in the Middle East as 6 million Jews living among 300 million Arab Muslims and about 2 billion Muslims. And that's the way Israelis see it. And the story that we're facing right now is a story of Iranian encirclement of Israel using proxies. We have Hezbollah in Lebanon. We have Iranian forces on our northeastern border with Syria. We have Iranian forces just over Jordanian territory in Iraq. We have an Iranian proxy in Yemen that is attacking shipping in the Red Sea and shooting at our southernmost city, which is Eilat. So we have a Middle East that's being shaped by the rise of Iranian power. And if you say that to a consumer of Western news coverage, they're kind of bewildered. They look at you like they've never heard any of this before, because they're being told some story about Israeli oppressors and Palestinian victims. And it's not that there's nothing to that story. It's not that it's a complete invention. It's just that it won't help you understand the broader sweep of events in the Middle East. And I think anyone hoping to understand this place needs to zoom out and look at what's going on across the region and not be seduced by a simple and mostly fictional story about good and evil.
All right, Mati, we will leave it there. I can attest to the fact that you don't only write about darkness. You've